Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. We're delighted to have you joining us for the Future of Human Connectivity, our summit in 3 parts. Before we get underway, a message from the chairman of The Hill, Jimmy Finkelstein.
Good morning. I'm Jimmy Finkelstein, chairman of The Hill, and I want to welcome you to the Future of Human Connectivity. I want to thank the audience for attending today. I want to thank our fantastic faculty for being with us and spending the day with us, and Steve Clemens will be moderating all day. Thank you, Steve. A special thanks to Chairman Pai of the FCC. The chairman has such a wonderful background and so interesting. He went to Harvard. He went to the University of Chicago Law School, clerked for a federal court. He worked at Jenner and Block. He worked as a counsel in the Senate. He worked as a general counsel to one of our great companies in the United States. Worked in various different offices at the FCC, and of course now he's chairman of the FCC. He has such a great background and has such a important role in what we see and what we hear. Probably the most important person in America in this area. What happens in terms of 5G, what happens in the First Amendment, what happens in broadband, net neutrality, I could go on and on and on. He's just a critical, in a critical place at a critical time in terms of human connectivity. So it's an honor, Chairman Pai, to have you. And at this point, I'm going to turn over the program to Bob Cusack, our great editor of The Hill, and I will leave you, Bob, to interview the chairman. Have a nice day. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Chairman Pai, for joining us. I did want to start with a COVID question. In the CARES Act, Mr. Chairman, there was $200 million in telehealth, and FCC has taken the lead on this. That money has been exhausted. Should Congress replenish this fund?
Question. I'd be remiss though if I didn't say thank you for hosting this conversation. Thanks to Mr. Finkelstein for the very kind introduction, and thanks to Steve Clemens, of course, for moderating over the entire panel. Telehealth, I think, has had its moment to shine in the middle of this dismal pandemic. And one of the things that we pitched Congress early on was this telehealth program, which they gave us authority to do in the CARES Act. I think thus far, at least, the program has been very, very successful. The 539 applications we granted have already started, some of them submitting stories about how they're using this funding to extend their healthcare expertise, improve access and outcomes. And if Congress sees fit to increase the funding through that program or through a similar program, we would certainly duly administer it. And we're working with Congress on some of those discussions right now. But it's too early to say, I think, whether and to what extent they will extend funding for a further round.
Mr. Chairman, schools are starting up, and of course, many are going remote learning. You've asked Congress for more funding and authority on this issue. Are you hopeful that this is going to be in the next package? And why do you need this authority? Was it not included in prior packages?
So we did ask Congress in the earlier round of negotiations that led to the CARES Act to consider the creation of a remote learning initiative that was a streamlined program, somewhat similar to what they did give us authority to do in telehealth, because we wanted to have a more targeted solution that was outside of the bureaucratic rules and processes that attended our E-rate program, which is an important program. But given the nature of the emergency, we need to distribute funding more quickly and in a more flexible way. Also, the statute that we administer, the E-rate statute, limits our ability to support these services to classrooms. It uses that term, classrooms. And so we wanted to make sure we worked with Congress proactively, and we've done that since early March. So I hope that we are able to continue to work with Congress and those members of Congress who are interested in remote learning solutions. Obviously, with the school year coming up and with many schools going virtual, this is a more important issue than ever.
Earlier this year, FCC fined Sinclair a record amount. On a separate issue recently, Sinclair was going to broadcast a program that had a conspiracy theory about Anthony Fauci and COVID-19. Sinclair decided not to run that. Was that the right decision, and would have the FCC gotten involved in this kind of issue?
I can't say, of course, whether the FCC would have gotten involved. And traditionally, of course, the FCC doesn't weigh in on editorial judgments made by broadcast companies about the content of newscasts. So unfortunately, I can't weigh in on that particular issue. just as I haven't weighed in on issues similar to that over the past 3.5 years since I've become chairman. So unfortunately, I can't give you much insight on that.
In June, there were 4 Republican senators who wrote to you, and they basically want you to redefine so-called Section 230. The White House has also issued a presidential executive order on this, highlighting social media bias. Is there a bias, and if so, what, if anything, is FCC going to do about it?
Well, in terms of what we're going to do about it, we just recently received the petition from the NTIA, a part of the Department of Commerce, that submitted a petition for rulemaking. And so we will carefully review that petition in the days to come. But what I will say is, back in November of 2017, I gave a speech in which I highlighted the fact that transparency, I think, is very important when it comes to social media platforms, how these companies are making decisions about what we see and what we don't, for instance. And I think that is one of the issues that is animating both sides of Congress now and both houses of Congress to think about some of these issues. In fact, just shortly, you'll see, among other things, this issue being discussed, I anticipate, at a hearing that's going to be held before the House Judiciary Committee. And so it's interesting that elected lawmakers now, too, have focused on this as an issue.
Yeah, that was my next question, actually, about that hearing. Obviously, a lot of tech CEOs, it's going to be a big story of the day. There has been pressure on social media companies, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, and Twitter just recently, they have started to correct the president's tweets and also kind of put Donald Trump Jr. on the sideline. I know you're a big defender of the First Amendment. Do you think this is a good idea, or is this a slippery slope?
Well, again, this is one of the issues that may be intertwined in the petition for rulemaking, so I can't comment on any particular controversy, but what I will say is what I've said for a couple of years, is that transparency in these social media platforms is important. It's important for consumers to understand exactly how the platforms are making some of these decisions. And some would argue that there isn't such transparency now. And I think that's part of the reason why this is one of the strands that we would anticipate hearing in the deliberations today, and that we've heard from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle over the past couple of months and years.
It's been a couple years since FCC repealed the net neutrality Obama-era rules. What has been the impact of that? And I know that you're working with FTC on this, but Joe Biden has said if he's elected, he would restore them. What would be the impact of that as well?
Well, certainly I can't predict what any future FCC would do. We are an independent agency, and so obviously a future independent agency would have to make an independent judgment about the way forward. But overall, I think the decision has been very much positive. If you look at ever since December 14th of 2017, when we voted, the average fixed broadband speeds in the United States are up 87%, according to Ookla, which is an independent third party that assesses broadband speeds in the United States. Infrastructure investment in the aggregate has gone up. Millions more Americans have access to the internet than before. The online experience is free and open, as we can see across these different platforms in terms of the transmission of data. And moreover, what is very interesting is the comparison with Europe, which does have these utility-style, heavy-handed net neutrality regulations. Not only have they seen less infrastructure investment as a result, but at the onset of the pandemic, the European Commission had to go hand in hand to YouTube and Netflix and all these other streaming companies and ask them to proactively throttle video content to consumers. So consumers are now getting a worse video product over the internet than they did before. And so I would argue our light touch market-based regulation has been entirely the right one. And it has proven some of these hysterical predictions that we saw 2.5 years ago about having to pay $5 per tweet or getting the internet one word at a time or the internet not even existing anymore. It's put all those hysterical predictions to bed.
Have you seen any anti-competitive behavior? Because those were some of the predictions that companies would try to game the system, and you've deferred to FTC on that. Has there been enforcement in this area since the rules were adopted?
So as you pointed out earlier, we do have a memorandum of understanding with the Federal Trade Commission, so we work with them. And so any allegation that we receive of any competitive conduct or conduct that otherwise might violate Section 5 of the FTC Act, we, of course, would share that with them. And I think one of the things that's instructive is during the deliberations up to net neutrality, the 2017 decision, and even thereafter, all of these allegations are always said, well, if this happens or should this happen. And that's entirely the point. Unless there's a demonstrated market failure, preemptive regulation of all 4,400 and some internet service providers of the FCC is inappropriate. The way to handle instances of anti-competitive conduct is to look at the particular company that is allegedly engaging in that conduct and use targeted antitrust or consumer protection laws to address it. It's not to have a blanket rule of utility-style regulation at the FCC. And so I think just the very existence of the question hints at the fact that we made the right determination in terms of our light touch framework. Oh, I would also add, by the way, the transparency rule we adopted at the FCC is very, very powerful because all of these internet service providers have to disclose publicly their business practices, network management practices, et cetera. So we have front-end enforcement at the FCC, backed up by the FTC and the Department of Justice potentially for antitrust or other anti-competitive conduct.
Earlier this year, Mr. Chairman, some House Democrats called on FCC to act on Russian propaganda on U.S. radio stations, citing Russian interference in the 2016 election. Yesterday, Attorney General Barr indicated, yes, Russia did interfere in the 2016 election, and they're probably interfering or trying to in the 2020 election. What is FCC doing on this interference?
So as I responded to those representatives who wrote to us, we will always administer the laws and regulations of the FCC faithfully. And so if there's a particular allegation or concern that they have, we want to make sure we're apprised of it so that we can take appropriate action on it. And so here too, as with all of these cases, we are going to take a look at the facts, apply the law fairly and dispassionately, and make the appropriate decision in the public interest.
One of the big issues that I think got lost in the COVID area is that there's been a suicide hotline, and that's especially important, well, before COVID-19, but especially since COVID-19. And it would set up 988 as a quick phone line. This is going to take a little time to implement. How many lives do you think this will save with a 3-digit phone line?
That's a great question. I mean, it's hard to portend a particular number, but I think it's going to be in the thousands. If you look at the number of people who call today, it's something like 2 million people per year. We anticipate that many more will call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline through 988 after it's implemented fully by July 16th of 2022. There are millions more who are, of course, struggling with issues of suicidal ideation or mental health illness. And our goal is to make sure that when they are struggling, when they're in a moment of crisis, they won't have to think about that 10-digit number, which is important, but it's sometimes hard to remember. Instead, 988 will be embedded in their consciousness, in all of our consciousness, just as 911 is for emergencies. And I think the ease of that number, getting access to trained counselors who can help, is going to save tremendous numbers of lives. I've seen it, for example, in a visit to the Toledo Mental Health Center that I did earlier this year, where some of those counselors told me that they are able to intervene successfully in 95% of the cases for people who call or who come in. That's a tremendous success rate. And I think it shows the fact that when people are struggling, when they feel alone, especially during the pandemic, when social isolation, unfortunately, is the norm for many people, all it takes is a point of human contact who lets them know that they are loved, there's someone out there who can help, and that there's a better way forward. And that can make all the difference. So I'm really excited. And I think that this decision is going to herald a tremendous number of lives saved in the years to come.
Robocalls, it's the number one consumer complaint at the FCC. I know you're very familiar with this. Congress has passed laws on this. A lot of people have disconnected from their landline, but we still all get robocalls. What's the status of implementation, and when are these robocalls going to stop or at least be curtailed?
So we have seen a downtick during the pandemic of something like 30 to 40% of the robocalls. But even without that, the FCC has been pulling out the stops to attack this top consumer protection priority. We, for example, have mandated that phone companies adopt a new caller ID authentication framework that essentially legitimates every single phone number and lets callers know, or lets the recipients of calls know, that the person calling is legitimately assigned that phone number. We've also empowered phone companies and encouraged them to block robocalls by default. We've also set up a reassigned numbers database so that people who get a phone call that's meant for somebody else, that they won't get those phone calls in the future. We've also made clear through a variety of different rulings that we expect gateway providers, these are the first points of contact in the United States for these foreign robocalls, to cut off these robocalls immediately. This is a joint effort with the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And over the past couple of months, we've actually gotten tremendous success where we sent letters to these gateway providers. We tell them, look, cut off the robocalls or you risk being cut off from the U.S. network. And within 24 hours, they end those robocalls. So we've really amped up our efforts, and I know that those robocalls remain a concern for consumers. They are for me personally as a consumer myself, but we are taking aggressive action to make sure that this scourge of civilization, as former Senator Fritz Hollings once called it, becomes something we read about in the history books.
FCC has found Huawei and ZTE have ties to the Chinese Communist Party. They obviously disagree with that. How confident are you in that finding, and what does that finding mean in this 5G world? And do you also consult with the State Department and other departments about these issues?
Yeah, tackling the last question first, absolutely. We have had a joint effort across government, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, White House National Security Council, and others who have equities in this issue. And part of the reason is that, of course, 5G and related communication security issues cut across all of these different agencies and all of the different industries and aspects of our society. And especially when you're talking about 5G, which will underlie everything from transportation to healthcare, agriculture to manufacturing, it's important that we get it right at the outset so that we're not left a few years from now trying to retrofit security solutions onto an already built network. And so at the FCC, at least, we've worked very diligently to make sure that any universal service funds, that is the federal subsidies that we oversee, are not spent on problematic equipment. And based on consultation with the intelligence community and the national security agencies, we determined that Huawei and ZTE did present such a threat, such a problem. And additionally, I personally have been involved in working with some of our foreign counterparts everywhere from the United Kingdom to India to Brazil to Israel to make sure that we have a shared understanding about a risk-based framework for what equipment and services go into these networks. And that international effort is extremely important because, of course, when you're talking about a 5G network being built at a global scale, if the United States goes in one direction, we want to make sure that as many countries as possible also go in that same direction.
You know, I talk to a lot of people in the so-called Acela corridor, and where the internet is very strong. But in rural areas, the internet is not very strong. So can you talk about that, and specifically on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund? What's the status of that and that auction? And now more than ever, is getting broadband to everywhere.
A critical issue. Our top issue has been closing the digital divide over the last 3.5 years. And that's something I take personally, having grown up in a small town of Parsons, Kansas, about 3 hours south of Kansas City. And we're keenly aware during the pandemic, of course, that broadband is more important than ever for telework, telehealth, distance learning, and the rest. And there are millions of Americans who don't have it. And so on October 29th, we're going to be starting the first phase of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that you mentioned. This is going to be a $16 billion program in the first phase, $4 billion in the second phase, to target up to 6 million homes and businesses that we know, based on whatever broadband map you consult, do not have access to broadband at the FCC's definition of 25 megabits per second. We're targeting unserved areas. We're encouraging competition from a variety of companies using a variety of technologies. And critically, we are instituting very strict accountability measures. The funding that they get, they have to use to build out broadband on a specified time frame. Otherwise, there are penalties for non-performance. And that's absolutely critical. It's one thing to, of course, start a program and get all the nice press releases out of it. What matters to me is getting those millions of Americans connected to the internet. It's more critical than ever. And this FCC is determined to do whatever we can to close that divide and deliver what I call digital opportunity to everybody, regardless of where they live.
There's pending legislation from Republican senators on the Digital Opportunity Fund, which would basically call for an accelerated deployment. Do you think that bill is a good idea?
So the bill that I'm thinking about, one of the concerns I have is that it would require us to change course in such a way that inadvertently it would require us to do some certain administrative processes and delay the auction, delay the distribution of the funding. And that's not something I think anybody wants to see. So we're always looking for creative solutions. If Congress sees fit to work with us on legislation along these lines, we really wanted to augment our efforts as opposed to inadvertently delay them. And so we've had extensive conversations with Republicans and Democrats who share our priority on this, and hopefully we'll be able to make our way forward on October 29th or sooner if there's a creative solution with this RDOF.
Chairman Pai, last question. How has COVID-19 affected your day-to-day life and also the day-to-day life of FCC employees? Where do you see them as far as working from home? It seems like it's going to go into 2021. Just kind of a day in the life of both yours and your employees of how you're getting through this time period.
Yeah, it's been a challenge. And as you can see from my background, this has been my home office for the past almost 5 months now. And we were one of the first agencies to move to stay at home, work from home protocols. And that was because, as I told the FCC staff, their health and safety is always going to be my top priority. They are the best asset that any federal agency could ever have. And I want to make sure that they know that we have their back in terms of making sure they're able to do their job safely. And so they've been incredibly productive, not just the bread and butter work of setting up things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or the 5G spectrum auction we have going on right now, but also all of the COVID-related work, the telehealth program that we talked about, and a few other things that they've been going above and beyond. And so we are going to be working from home for the next several months, and we are anticipating at some point moving to our new building, which is across the street from NPR here in Washington, for folks who know that area. But the important thing to me is to make sure that if and when the FCC is able to move into that building, we're able to do so safely. And I just want to commend again all of the federal staff in Washington and across the country at the FCC who've done heroic work. People may never know their names or even the particular orders they've worked on, but they see the benefit at the end of the day with broadband and telehealth, ending some of these robocalls and so many other things that are critical to our daily lives. They are the unsung heroes of public service, in my view.
Chairman Pai, thank you for joining us this morning.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
And I'll hand it back to Steve.
Great to see you, Bob. I mean, I remember the last time we saw Chairman Pai. Do you remember where that was?
No, you didn't tell me.
Will on the Hill.
Oh, that's right.
We were
That's
dressed
right.
in
charity
Shakespearean outfits and raising money for the arts and children. And Chairman Pai was great that time. In any case, thank you, Bob, and Chairman Pai, for those insightful thoughts about this world we're walking into.